So Sean is the man behind Mythos and Logos World Mythology, and we've had the pleasure of having many discussions in the past. All of those are hosted on his channel. So if you want to check those out or see what else Sean is doing, go to his channel. I'll have it linked in the description. Sean, thanks for joining.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Matt. As always, we have had a lot of great chats. I'll leave some links for sure, but glad to be in your domain for this time, introducing myself to your audience, and well, very excited to see what your take on one of these conversations may look like. So, really appreciate it.
Sweet. So anytime we talk, it's usually surrounding mythology. That is your bread and butter, and it intersects with many of the things that I'm interested in. But one of the things I've been interested in recently is sort of the big questions behind the stories that kind of make us as a people. Maybe in the West, but those are all over the place, right? Every society has a mythology, and that's an interesting thought that there are myths everywhere, and they all kind of do the same thing. So I'd like to open us up by asking, what is a myth?
Yeah, great question, and a great place to always start getting your definitions in. The most important thing to know: a myth is not something to be busted. A myth is not a lie. The more classical understanding of it, the type of scholarly understanding that someone like Jung or Joseph Campbell, who we'll chat about, had of a myth is, I like to say, a symbolic story, specifically a symbolic story that tells you something about yourself, the cosmos, or your place in it. Oftentimes they feature gods and goddesses. Oftentimes they do not. But I think there's something of the age that certainly plays a factor in it. But there are some modern stories that I think may in the future be referred to as our mythology. I'm very curious to see where some of that may end up. But a symbolic story, regardless of any literal or historical truth, some of them claim to give that, some do not. It's going to teach you something about yourself and the world and the cosmos and your place in it.
There are stories, historical stories that get mythologized. I think Alexander the Great is a good example of that. He's a guy. He did real things, but sometimes what we hear about him is tinged with the mythical. And so, how do we differentiate between something that's a myth and something that's just an old story or a history?
Yeah, that is a really great question. And it can sometimes be difficult because you're exactly right that they do have a lot of crossover. And even if we look at the oldest in the Western canon histories, we look at someone like Herodotus, a lot of those are somewhat mythologized too. I believe it's in Herodotus that we get the story of Alexander cutting the Gordian knot. It's certainly in Herodotus that we get a lot of our first discussions of the oracle and her prophecies and of the foundation of that institution we had looked at in one of our conversations. It can be really difficult. Another side of that, and you mentioned these are something you have all over the world. If you look at Australia, oral tradition goes back telling of events at least 7,000 years ago.
Wow.
We know that because in Australia, the stories are told about the land. People have an incredibly strong connection and ties to the land and country that they're from, far more so than I could relate to personally. I mean, I come from a family who crossed an ocean to come to the continent I'm at now, and then I crossed half of that continent to get to where I'm building my home now. Whereas in the Australian context, people were often in the same place for tribal groups for thousands upon thousands of years. So we have stories where spots that are underwater, folks will be rowing around in a boat and say, no, we can't go there. This was created as someone else's land.
Hmm.
A geology professor from the University of Melbourne, I believe. I have it cited in the video, so if I'm wrong here, I'm right there. But who had then studied the maps of where these turnaround areas were, the areas that were someone else's land, equivocate to land borders that were last visible in the last ice age.
Wow.
So there we see myth having a very strong cultural component of this is my land, this is your land. These are the stories of the creation of this feature and this feature that teaches you how to live in a very down to earth sense day to day. We also have stories where oftentimes, if we look at in the Western cultural canon you and I belong to, something like Genesis, where yes, there are folks who take it as a literal history, but first video we ever made on my channel was talking about how I think that's a pretty difficult thing to do considering you get two different stories. And that led me down this journey that the Mythos and Logos channel has really become of saying, okay, if we have story A, when there were animals and no people yet, people come last,
Mm.
and story B, when God had made the people but hadn't made animals yet, he was looking for a companion. I think a lot of times these stories, if you're trying to look at a literal historical application, they don't fit. Sometimes they do, and it is really cool when they do, but oftentimes they just can't, even when those are some of the most foundational stories to what we have. And to, I mean, if you look at the Judeo Christian Islamic cultures that have come from that Genesis story, those Genesis stories, the foundation is something that you can't take all that literally, if you ask me. And that led me to, okay, what makes this so important then? What keeps people telling these for thousands of years
Mm.
if it's not remembering where a border is, if it's not remembering this is where the ancestor planted yams, so it's a great place to go for yams when you're a hunter gatherer. But those stories that can't tell us that, and that is not to disrespect the stories that tell you about the earth and its foundation, but that was what first opened my mind to looking at a symbolic kind of understanding.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of a quote from Leon Cass in his book Beginning of Wisdom. He says, you know, Genesis, whether or not it's a, this is a paraphrase, but whether or not it's a story of what happened, it's definitely a story of what always happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a model for, I mean, from my perspective, Genesis is primarily an anthropological text, telling us about who we are rather than a cosmological text. Um, but your story about Australia is very interesting because one of the things that I've been really mulling through is sort of the modern, I say modern, you know, post 1500, the modern man's um, sort of fixation with calling something a myth and then saying therefore it's all false, or saying it's useless. There's nothing there to sort of to sort of glean from. My, you know, my kind of task recently has sort of been that, like, this kind of reenchantment of history and wondering, you know, what elements of these that we're calling myths can we actually say, oh, you know, maybe that happened, or maybe, you know, there was something. You know, Alexander the Great's a good example. I go back to him. Like, everyone looks at the story surrounding him and like, well, okay, that's clearly false, clearly false, clearly false. The man was in there somewhere, but here's all the myth. And I've just been really interested in maybe just questioning those assumptions and saying, okay, so we have a myth, you know, where is the truth in there, and how, and is it worth looking for, even as far as the historical elements of it go.
Right. So I'd say if you're looking for where the greater truth is than a historical truth in a myth, I'd start by asking a question of why are we still telling it? So if we look at in the Greek corpus, something like the Iliad and Odyssey, Those are stories that we have been telling and are still telling to these days. I mean, even on cinematic screens now, we're still telling the Iliad and Odyssey. Maybe not necessarily in always the most true to the originals versions, but the core stories are still there. And these are stories that before it was a single director's vision that could change things, were told from oral traditions of essentially bards singing these poems where there has to be something in it for it to be good enough for people to remember for hundreds and thousands of years before you get the folks writing it down, before you get the folks who are putting it on film. Uh, and I think with the Iliad, which is one I love to go to, you could see the importance of the humanity of characters like Achilles in it. The first word of the Iliad is rage. It's not the gods, it's rage. Speak of the rage of Achilles. It's a core human emotion. And yet there are points where in the beginning, Achilles, in his rage at feeling slighted by his general Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, he's ready to strike him. But what happens? Athena takes his hand and stops it before he pulls his sword to try and strike down Agamemnon. So, what's Athena? Wisdom. So,
Hmm.
wisdom is stopping the great warrior from acting out in his rage and striking down his leader that would lead to all of this chaos. You can take that wisdom and, as the Greeks did, attribute a divinity to that. You can take these forces that are greater than us, that can guide us, that can work through us, and attribute a divinity to that. Because also in mythologies, my channel, I specifically call it Mythos and Logos, World Mythology and Religions. And that's because even though I'm not a religious scholar, I don't have any formal training in religion, though I was a lay minister. I still want to draw attention to the fact that these stories were parts of, and in many cases are still parts of, living religions, living systems. A
Hmm.
lot of the oldest Greek stories we have are from the Homeric hymns to Apollo, attributed to the same Homer as the Iliad and Odyssey, as much as there was a guy named Homer, but it's more so belonging called Homeric because they belong to that same tradition. Those were typically performed as hymns, as songs during festivals to each god. And then folks would offer their sacrifices or have their festival games or go to the temples. And the story was part of that. It's like if you go to a Christian church, there's a good chance you're getting, especially if you're in one that's more in the Catholic or Orthodox derived tradition, you're getting the homilies, you're getting stories and interpretations of them within this ritual. Religious ritual is so fascinating in that it seeks to connect us to those bits of divinity that are greater to us. And I think that whether you are a follower of the religions or not, you can still find that connection in the stories themselves.
Hmm.
And I think whichever religion you're a follower of, if any, you can still gain a lot from the other stories too.
Yeah. So there are two questions that I've got. The first question, and this is something that's sort of relevant to something that I'm studying, and it may be something that you have a sense of. It may be kind of outside your wheelhouse, but by and large, as we look at old myths, um, do the so when we look at myths, right, in a modern time, we say, oh, here's a bunch of false stories. Um, did the people listening to the myths in their own time and place believe that they were false, or what were their beliefs about the myths?
It's a great question. And it's definitely one that can be hard to answer because we don't know what the Joe Everyman of ancient Greece or ancient Persia or ancient India or Australia or anywhere would have said, because in many cases it's not Joe Everyman who still
Yeah.
is source that we have.
Yeah.
Um, we do have, for example, Socrates, who I know we had discussed once, treated the myths as though they were true, though he didn't know necessarily one way or the other. He said it's easier to just stick with it because that's what the culture does, so I'll do it. How
Yeah.
much, knowing Socrates, that's his personal belief, and how much it's him not wanting to, well, corrupt the youth too much? Who knows? But me personally, I would be surprised if we didn't have true believers and skeptics in every age, the same ways we have true believers and skeptics of
Yeah.
just about everything today.
Yeah, I mean, well, it appears that there are stories of people acting on the myths, right? I mean, you mentioned the folks in Australia navigating
Mhm.
via these oral traditions, but then I think about I think it's in Acts actually, where Paul and one of his companions come into a town and they treat them like gods because they do some kind of miracle. And
Mhm.
when they do that, it was because, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is extra biblical, but I think it was because there was a story that had been told that Zeus came down, and he was, I think it was Zeus, came down to this same city, and he was not accepted, and there were some serious punishments for this city because they didn't heed, you know, the gods coming down and doing the thing. I'll have to check up on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
Right.
And so now Paul comes into this town, and they're like, "Well, we're just gonna play it safe, and we're gonna treat you like a god just in case." So there are examples in you know, in ancient texts of people orienting themselves in a certain way because of a story that they have been passed
Mhm.
down.
And that we do definitely know, because a lot of the cultural values were transmitted via mythology. But you can look at a story like Lycaon, the first werewolf. He's a Greek king in ancient days in, I believe, near Sparta, though he wasn't a Spartan. But he had actually had guests and cooked and eaten them. He was a cannibal. And that did not make Zeus happy, because one of Zeus's uh, surnames or epithets, the different aspects of the god, was Zeus, the god of hospitality. To the Greeks, and we know this from looking at the Odyssey as well, Odysseus is welcomed in many places because of how important hospitality was. It's also the taking advantage of the hospitality that Penelope's suitors do for the
Mhm.
years while Odysseus is lost, just running his house into the ground while going after his wife. So we definitely know that whether or not someone would say Zeus is going to strike me with a lightning bolt if I'm not hospitable to you, we do know that people took these values very seriously and communicated the importance of them through these stories of the gods.
Right.
That if you're not treating your guests with kindness, if you're taking advantage of them, then there's nothing separating you from the animals. You're a wolf like Lycaon. And when you're a wolf, you're beastly, yeah, you're going to get struck down. Maybe it's a bolt of lightning. Maybe it's all of your neighbors declare a war on you. Maybe it's some other type of karma. But that cause and effect relationship. Um, I also think a great set of stories that shows where myths can sometimes be thought of as divine and sometimes not. If you look at the stories we know as Aesop's fables, we think of them as like ancient morality tales, stuff like sour grapes, things like that. But a lot of those Aesop fables are actually not just from Aesop the guy, but you see in other stories in South and Southeast Asia, they're Jataka tales, which are stories of the Buddha in past incarnations, where there's a Jataka tale that matches an Aesop fable, I believe, where a lion has his life saved by a deer or some animal that would usually be its prey, and then the lion is kind to it. I believe it's definitely a Jataka tale. I'm not sure if that's an Aesop fable, but a number of them have crossovers
Hmm.
where what in one culture might be viewed of as a morality tale, you can find the exact same story presented in another as a story of a divine enlightened being's past life. And maybe that means that the morality tale is something that can enlighten you, that can make you divine, or a sign of that if you're following it.
That's interesting. It would be kind of cool to do like a cross reference of all these stories and see where they intersect, because
Oh,
I'm sure there are many.
for sure. I mean, flood myths.
Hmm.
I'm in every place I've looked, I have yet to find a culture that doesn't have a flood myth of some sort,
Really?
at least for the ones where you have a lot of documented myths. I mean, I'm reading right now in the Brazilian indigenous stories, and there's a flood myth. In
Wow.
Mexico, the Maya tell how the first created people were not quite right, so they were too wild. So when the flood came, they ended up climbing the trees, and they're the monkeys. So that's why monkeys are kind of like humans, but a little bit more wild. You have the biblical flood myth, which is so parallel to the flood myth in the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Hmm.
Sumerian coming earlier. In China, you have a flood myth, and I think this one is so interesting because in China, it's not a guy gets a boat to survive it, but Yu becomes an engineer who builds dams to control the rivers so it doesn't flood anymore, and he becomes the first great emperor.
Huh.
So you can have these questions of how do your people react to chaos? Is it take care of yourself and your own and the people who will follow you and bring what you need to make it so the world will go on and shore yourself up against the chaos? Or is it you go to this position of leadership and you tame the chaos and make it work for you and build a society around it? Or is it well, flee from the chaos, but if you're not doing it right, you're going to become a wild man. But you have these same themes that present themselves so often, and a lot of people like to use that to say, well, clearly it means there was a great flood. Maybe not. Whether or not you want to say that, and I just won't say yes or no to anything for sure, because well, for the longest time, archaeology didn't think Troy existed, and then we followed the instructions of how to get there from the Iliad, and they found it. So,
That's
and
incredible.
whether or not the Trojan War happened as we know it is kind of a question, and also whether or not there was a flood, or whether places flood a lot and it's something you remember,
Yeah.
or whether it's no matter what you do, sometimes chaos is going to feel overwhelming and you need to do something about it.
Yeah. I'm reading a really interesting book right now from a guy named Eric Jacobus.
Mhm.
Uh, I'm actually going to have him on the channel here pretty soon too.
Oh, cool.
And his book is about violence, and he basically says that violence, there's like a language of violence, and he talks about the development of languages. It goes in some interesting directions, but the point I'm trying to make here is that uh, according to him, I haven't fact checked this, but every language that's in development comes up with the same colors first. It's always red first.
Yes, light,
Um,
dark, red,
yeah,
then I think
and
blue,
then it's like,
green.
yeah, there's and so like if you kind of extrapolate that a little bit to like bigger concepts, there might be an argument to make that even within these developing mythologies, maybe the flood just is one of those elements of language that just has to come
Mhm.
first, or early on. Very interesting.
For sure. I'm interested to hear that conversation you have with him too. Very yeah, a lot that could go into that. Language is so fascinating.
Yeah. So the next question I had was, let's talk about modern cosmologies.
Mm.
Cosmology is a part of many myths, not all myths, but many myths, and we have sort of supplanted our cosmological mythology with a scientific cosmology.
Mhm.
Do you think that that scientific cosmologies, we don't have to necessarily pinpoint any one of them, Big Bang, evolutionary theory, even if you go back to more like quantum physics stuff, do you think that they serve a similar purpose in our culture that a
Hmm.
myth would have served in an ancient culture?
That is a very great question. I think that they can, but maybe not always intentionally. Um, if you look at cosmology's origin stories, especially, I've found there are typically two main types. Could be something else, but I find often there's a single creator making the things or from which everything comes. I mean, even if you look in polytheistic, like Hindu type tradition, there's still the oneness in the beginning from which everything comes from. But then you also have cosmologies where the world's born of a chaos. If you look at the Sumerians, like we had mentioned with Gilgamesh, their origin story had Marduk and Tiamat, where basically our world is the remains of an ancient primordial chaos serpent goddess who was slain, and she makes up our world. For the Norse, it was an ice giant. The glaciers were the ice giant's teeth that are at the end of the world. For the Greeks, there was the war against the Titans beforehand.
Mhm.
But then you go to the monotheistic traditions and the polytheistic ones that share a certain unity at one point, and you have a oneness of creation, often with a more distinct purpose, harmonious as opposed to the chaos. And I think the way you look at where the world is coming from is very much going to shape how you look at what it can be and what it should be.
Hmm.
Um, I think that if you look at the evolutionary cosmology. If you're asking me literal facts, I'm going to go with science. If you're asking me the types of symbolic things that shape us, I'm going to go to story. I think there's a place for both. And very, I also am very aware that scientific theories have been proven wrong in the past and look forward to seeing what new discoveries we have. But at the moment, I certainly have no problem giving the work of scientists their due. I think it is interesting, though, when you can take that and there could be a positive way you view evolution as shaping a world of, okay, what kind of continual improvement can we build upon? Yet there can also be a dark side to it. There were empires that used evolution as an excuse to say a more developed culture should have
Sure.
survival of the fittest over another as a way to serve themselves. So I think at the same time, you have folks who can use a unitary sort of monotheistic classical cosmology that Christians might be used to as a way of saying all the world was created and God looked upon it and saw that it was good, so let's treasure life. And then you can also have folks who say all the world was created and God looked upon it and it was good, and then people made mistakes. And so if you're not down with it, then we got to get you out of it to make it good again. And
Hmm.
people are going to use
Yeah.
the same origin myth to forward their means, if that makes sense.
It's interesting to think about what a scientific cosmology has sort of paved the way for. I mean, atheism in mass, humanism in mass wasn't possible until we had an alternative cosmology. And you wouldn't necessarily think that that would be the linchpin for those systems to really develop, but it seemed like you really couldn't move on in any system until you kind of hammered out the cosmology. And I think that it's something that probably happens in every culture, religion. that question has to be answered. Where do we come from? Why are we here? And I just think it's interesting that what we would call, I mean, I think you used the word hard facts earlier, like what we would call just kind of facts, not not value laden necessarily,
Mhm.
have produced so many ideological systems surrounding them, and it must shed light on the importance of those questions at very least.
Right, for sure. And the ways that you can definitely use different frameworks and apply them to the hard facts differently. I mean, Big Bang Theory was developed by a Catholic priest,
Mm.
and if there was nothing and somebody said let there be light, that's a lot what it would look like.
Yeah, people were kind of, yeah, originally the more humanist types were sort of wary of that,
Right, looking
because
at
of the
more of a
eternal.
steady state.
Yeah,
Right.
right. An eternal universe was more, you know, appropriate among those types. Um, which is interesting now because it's kind of scary to your fundamentalist type Christians.
Mhm.
Um, however that works, I don't know. So yeah, I was really interested in the cosmology, and then that had me sort of thinking about modern myths.
Mhm.
And I know you mentioned earlier a couple of uh, ideas that you had about maybe what our culture is spitting out as far as myths go. And so, yeah, if you had
Absolutely.
some thoughts on that, I'd be interested.
Yes, I would be very happy to. So the way that I approach myth, symbolic stories that tell us about ourselves and about the cosmos and our place in it and the way we interact with it, it's definitely something that before I even had familiarized myself much with his own work, I realized was influenced by the work of Carl Jung, who very much developed archetypal psychology. Archetypes being kind of the fundamental patterns that we'll see repeating themselves in myths. Jung looked at mythology a lot, and a lot of the Jungians who followed him uh, in his approach to psychology often looked at it. There was Marie Louise von France, who's a big influence to the way I look at stories. Her main focus was looking at traditional fairy tales and seeing what their facts can tell us about the ways that our minds work and the ways that we approach the world. There's also someone like J. Marvin Spiegelman, who worked on a sort of personal mythologizing, where he would use this technique Jung developed called active imagination, which is basically just start thinking and go with it and see where it takes you. And then Spiegelman would apply that afterwards. He'd often journal or record a session like that, and then look into, okay, what universal patterns were going on in my mind? What can they tell me
Mm.
about myself? We go back to that Iliad Odyssey kind of look. We have uh, patterns of wisdom calming rage in the Achilles case. We have patterns of hospitality in the Lycaon case or the Odysseus case. And if we look at things like modern stories, we see a lot of those same patterns. Um, One fellow who was very much influenced by Jung, who I had known before I knew Jung well. I wouldn't say I know him well as much as a lot of folks do, but until I started learning his language, I'll put it that way. Uh, I had known Joseph Campbell. He had come up with this pattern called the hero's journey. And Campbell was very famous for having worked with George Lucas on the Star Wars stories. But Campbell was a friend of Lucas and a strong influence to the original trilogy in particular, which does have a very much an archetypal aspect to it. I mean, Star Wars, when you look at it at the end of the day, it's knights and wizards fighting against forces of darkness. That's a King Arthur story. Excalibur is a lightsaber, and if you look at Joseph Campbell and his work, he came up with this pattern called the hero's journey. It's often been called the monomyth. Some folks have gone as far as to say that all stories are this story. I don't like any statement that uses the word all, because
Sure.
they tend to be just asking folks to prove them wrong. But you can look at this hero's journey pattern. You have your call to adventure, right? You're a farm boy living in your world in the desert, and all of a sudden these robots come to you. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. Supernatural aid comes because you meet this wizard who's able to control people's minds, tell them these are not the droids you're looking for. What is this going on? And also there's a question of, right, how much the Force would have brought R2 and 3PO to Luke in the first place, considering his place in it all. You have the guardian of the threshold, where this is your threshold between the known world and the unknown world. If you look at it in a Jungian perspective, it's the conscious and the unconscious, looking into the darker parts of your mind that aren't necessarily dark because they're like evil, but dark because they're unknown, and the kinds of places we need to go when we're faced with challenges. Obi-Wan is very much a guardian of the threshold while being a mentor figure as well. Challenges and temptations come, end up being a revelation. The world you knew isn't what you thought it was. No, I am your father, Luke. You have this same capability for darkness that killed your aunt and uncle within you. The empire that you hate, that has forcefully torn you out of the world you had known, that's in your blood, dude. You are capable of it.
Hmm.
That original sin is within you. Then you have to transform. You have to atone for it. Some, maybe it's atoning for your own sins. Maybe it's atoning for the sins of your father. You go down into the underworld and you have to save your father from it. You're Pinocchio taking Geppetto out of the belly of the whale. You're Luke needing to save Vader from the Emperor. And in the end, you return to that life. I mean, I think that actually the return where you become master of both worlds, the known and the unknown, I
Hmm.
think that that is actually why a lot of folks don't like the sequels, or the Last Jedi in particular. That Luke, rather than being the master of both of these worlds, the light and the darkness, and maybe it's just because you try to tell a story again, he has to face another kind of darkness. And maybe that's something uncomfortable, that it's not just one journey, and maybe we're going on this journey again and again and again.
Hmm.
It can be a karmic cosmic cycle, but I think that Campbell is an awesome frame for looking at how much the world and the stories we tell have these patterns. I mean, the death and rebirth going into darkness, I mean, it's the Christian story very much as well. Oftentimes people refuse that first call to the unknown. I mean, even when it's time for Christ to do his first miracle, he says, woman, my time has not come yet he has his threshold guardian, who I guess actually is Mary, which is interesting. She's the one who brings him into the world too.
Huh.
There's something in that. But she says, no, the party's out of wine, do it. And he honors his mother in doing that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where at the crucifixion, when he tells John, Ecce mater tua, this behold your mother, it's the same call to adventure to him. So the pattern carries on going forward. There
Hmm.
can be something to it, but I think Star Wars is such a great, because it's so well known to, kind of introduction to these mythic structures, these patterns in modern storytelling.
Was just out of curiosity, I don't know a lot about Jung. Actually, the only thing I know is sort of regurgitated through stuff that I've heard, like Joseph Peterson and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, was he a materialist?
Great question. So I like that you mentioned in the beginning re-enchantment being a priority of yours, because that, I think Jung would agree, was very much a priority of his as well. Best intro to him, look at The Undiscovered Self. Basically, it's very approachable. This copies 110 pages,
Wow.
$8.99, but who knows these days? I'd got it a while ago.
Yeah.
But Jung very much felt that modernity had separated us from a lot of these fundamental patterns that we have, the fundamental stories and archetypes and ways of looking at the world that teach us about our unconscious selves. And the undiscovered self and the challenge of that is we need to find ourselves, or else we're still going to be the slaves of everything that these forces that are controlling us.
Hmm.
And we have nuclear weapons now, it's probably not going to end well. That's something too. There's a self mastery to it. If you can bring it to the Greeks, if you can get to know the gods and revere them, if you're Achilles and you can revere wisdom stopping your rage, then that'll bring you someplace. And I think that's why these stories found themselves in these religious kind of practices. I mean, I don't know much about the folks who call themselves Jedi on the census as a religion, but I almost wonder if it's because there's a genuine, hey, this pattern really resonates with me kind of feeling.
Yeah,
Um,
that's kind of, sort of the question, right? Like if the patterns seem to be larger than it's super material, it's spiritual in some sense, right? Like the patterns exist independent of, well, everything else. I mean, I don't know, maybe you could just say it's all sort of psychological, it's all in our heads, but at very least there's there's something, you can't use the word physical, right? But there's something ontologically significant about the patterns that
yes.
dictate um, the formation of society,
Yes.
our inner selves, our outer selves, and so yeah, it's very interesting to think about um, what we can learn from that and sort of what we should prioritize if that's the truth.
Right. And I actually think it's so fascinating the way you mentioned language earlier with the guests you'll be having in a future interview, because you can view it as the patterns are the building blocks of the language that we speak internally,
Mhm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, it's almost like a meta language because it's not the language that we're speaking, you and I, but like that history is speaking, or that like the big human story is speaking.
Exactly. Yes. The if we want to use a very contemporary kind of uh, analogy, it's the code. It's
Hmm.
the foundation of our programming. If we have stories as a way of understanding the way that we are programmed, the way that the world around us is programmed, the ways that those programs interact with each other,
Mm,
then story being such a powerful human device makes it so that you a device so powerful you can remember where borders were 7,000 years ago.
mm,
It can give you a map to your own life, your own mind, your own workings. And if stories can help us understand that, I mean, can you really blame someone for attributing some divinity to that?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I'm reminded of Plato's Republic
mm,
when they're trying to determine what justice is, and they say, well, if you have something written in really small text, wouldn't it help if it were really big?
mm,
And that's the comparison, obviously, between the city and the individual. So they say, let's build a city to find out what justice is, so we don't have to look at the small little writing on the piece of paper. We can look at the big, plastered writing on the hillside, and it seems like that's relevant here because if you look at the big picture, the big stories, they're going to tell you something about the individual, um,
mm,
and it seems like you could even look at the individual's own personal journey,
mm.
perhaps, and see some of those, if things are kind of chucking on all cylinders, see some of those same, hero's journey elements of entering unknown things and ideally dying and resurrecting and coming out stronger, and all that stuff that we should be hoping to see in our own lives. Again, if everything's kind of working out.
Right. And I love the individual, the city. You could then extrapolate that to a nation, as there's that idea of microcosm and macrocosm. I'm in a house now, and if I look at a house, what's important in it? Okay, you've got to have a strong foundation. You look in a body, what's important to it? Like, if your physical foundation is something you've got to have, your basic health, low on that hierarchy of needs, some of the most important stuff. But if you're falling over, it's just the same as if your house's foundation is all out of whack.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have your, I'm seeing how far we can take this, right? It's a fun exercise looking at microcosm, macrocosm. You can have your front of the home, which is going to be your face that you show the world, the way you present themselves, your coat of paint, right? What you're showing in terms of the way you're presenting yourself to the world would be your front yard. Maybe your
Sure.
backyard is the things that are underneath and hidden that you're not showing to everyone as much, but you've got. You can look at maybe your attic is where your memories are. You don't need to access them all the time, but you've got your sentimental stuff and you want to hang on to it. So you put it someplace high up where it's not going to interfere with the rest, but where you still have it so you can go when you
Yeah.
need. Um,
Well, it's funny that you even mentioned that. Like think about you're talking about story and you're talking about custom. Like a household has those. It's a physical place, but what does it do? It features events like people that come and go and they do the same things every day, and the floor gets worn out. We're moving into a house as well, and that was one really interesting thing. You can tell where the previous owners were walking all the time because the
oh
floor
yeah.
was worn out in front of the sink, and up a certain way that they took the stairs,
Man,
and
that sounds like you've got some antique hardwood. Congrats.
yeah, yeah. So but to put it that way, like there's we look at ourselves as physical beings, but there's also sort of the things that we do, the way that we orient ourselves, our habits and customs that are dictated by, I think, some of these larger forces that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And then you even have, right, as we bring it more internally, less to the body, but more to the internal of the mind, could be like the internal of the home. You've got the parts that are sectioned off as this is the office, right? But you've got the parts that's the living room where you let people in. You've got the
Mm,
ways you greet them. You've got the things that everybody can see, but then you've got the innermost, right? The master bedroom usually isn't at the front of the house. It's usually in the back if you're in a house with those separate rooms. Because obviously this, I mean, different cultures have different houses. Sometimes your whole family lives in one. And
mm,
is that not also a household, right?
mm.
Where the family unit too. So interesting. But I'll stick with the one I'm in because it's always going to be the one I know best, even though there's lots to gain from getting to know the others too. That you have your bedroom that's deep in that, you're probably only inviting one person into that really, really knows you. And it's very much something where you could take bringing it back to stories, showing the ways that patterns and the ways we look at the world can influence, I mean, the way we are, the way we build the selves that we make, and the ways we build, the ways we interact with each other, the ways we build our societies.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and as we talk about these archetypes, this might be getting into woo woo territory,
Oh,
but
that's the fun stuff. Let's go.
well, okay, just to take a step back, I recently did a lot of studying and wrote a book on Genesis, on the first four chapters of Genesis, and one of the takeaways that I got, and it's really changed sort of the way that I look at things, is that creation is really critical to who we are as people. That we are creative beings in the image of a creator.
Mhm.
And I was looking at, so God spoke and things happened, things came to being, and we have sort of this marginal ability to do the same
Mhm.
thing, whether we're speaking, we're telling stories, or we're, writing stories, or making music, or making art, whatever it is. And one of the things that just has struck me since I've been intentionally creative is the realness of the stuff that we create.
Mhm.
If you've ever read like a really good novel, and it almost feels more real than reality. It feels like that world exists, and I just wonder. I wonder how much of that is sort of tapping into these big stories, or tapping into this archetype, or an archetype that allows it to sort of be bigger than itself.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the muses, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because that's definitely the same muse that inspired you in We Are Icarus too, with creativity being a key part, rather than just speaking and saying it's done and having your wildest dreams that end up unfulfilling. It is something that we're humans. We've got to toil the ground. We've got to put in the physical work too, and I love it. Just the work is something so so good, really,
Yeah.
if you ask me. And I know a lot of people aren't going to maybe like that, but I don't think work in terms of a like, you're stuck at a job you hate is necessarily going to be
Yeah.
it. But work where you
That's
are,
toil.
yes, but putting in effort
Mm-hmm.
and having something come out of it, putting effort into yourself and having something come out of it, putting something into your home and having something come out of it, putting something effort into your creativity, all of that. And there is, when it's really good, man, it just feels like it is something greater that you're tapping into. If you're an artist, you're a creative, you've probably felt that, where it's like a lot of the great songwriters have said, man, by that point the song was writing and I was just the one with the pen. uh, and
Mm-hmm.
and what is that but the invocation to the muses who inspire everything that comes at the beginning of each of the epics, each of
Yeah.
those Homeric hymns.
Yeah. I mean, just to speak, and I don't want to sound like I'm a fantastic artist or anything like that, but to speak to that, when I'm writing novels, a lot of times it feels like, yeah, like just like you said, there's not a lot of choice. It's like, okay, this is what's going to happen, and I'm just, you're it's like a statue, right? The
Mhm.
statue's in the marble, and your job is to take away everything that's not the statue, to make it, present to the world. But the statue existed before you carved it out of
Mhm.
that marble. And so, I don't know what that is, but there is something to it, and it sure is fun, I'll tell you that.
Oh, for sure.
And one of the things that came to mind when you were talking about work is sort of anecdotal. My job is seasonal, so I work from April 1st to Thanksgiving, and then I have 4 months off, which I try to do writing and stuff, other projects. But this winter I wasn't working, and I didn't feel very good.
Mhm.
Just generally not feeling great. And I've been back to work, and it's been 12-hour days in a row. And I
Mhm.
felt way better than when I wasn't working.
Mm.
It's just, I don't know. It's just the way that we're wired.
Yeah. Well, and as we've now passed the hour, if you've been listening for an hour, congratulations. You get to go past the front door and get a little bit of the living room right now. So, to give a little bit of me, every Lunar New Year, we accompany one of my best friends and his mom to our local Buddhist temple. It's great. As my friend's mom, I call her my Vietnamese auntie, says, Buddha doesn't care who you pray to. So if you go there and you pray to Jesus, he's just happy you're there, and Buddha doesn't care. So go for it.
That's
But
cool.
but one thing we do for every Lunar New Year is get a fortune, and it's great because it also forces me to have her there because I do not speak Vietnamese at all.
You
But
got
the
to know if it's
fortunes
good
are
or
all
not.
in
Yeah.
Vietnamese. Exactly. So mine for this current year was basically saying you need to work twice as hard. It was saying when you go hunting, you're going to need to put 2 tips on your arrow. And when you're fishing, you're going to need 2 hooks. And it's something I've taken very much as a personal motivation. Um, Working twice as hard, not in toil, but in being present and making effort in what matters and not refusing the call to adventure of going into the unknown, but of really um, addressing the parts of myself that need addressing.
Mm,
It's something that's been really motivating me, and what I think is cool to bring it into the myth and religion and practice of it. And it's fascinating too because one thing people do, the being who gives out the fortunes is Guan Yin, also called Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. Bodhisattva is kind of like a blend between an angel and a saint. It's somebody who has reached enlightenment, but has vowed to be reincarnated to help others until they all reach enlightenment too.
huh.
And uh, Guan Yin, or Avalokiteshvara, is the bodhisattva of infinite compassion. And at the one thing that's traditional is folks will leave an offering of a candle, and one of the candles that was there was actually a prayer candle of the Virgin Mary. So I guess I wasn't the only person going there praying to Jesus, and Buddha was cool with it. But um, but all that's to say that you can bring in then stories of mercy and of compassion, and that when your fortune is, hey, it's not going to be easy, you're going to need to work twice as hard, knowing that that's something compassionate. It's giving you a certain mercy if you're working at the right things.
Mm.
And maybe someone else's fortune is something different. And I mean, when we said, "Oh, are you going to get your fortune?" She said, "Oh, I'm old. I don't need a fortune anymore." So maybe there's a certain point where you get to retire and rest and maybe serve as that guide to others, right? If you bring it back to the hero's journey, it wasn't Obi-Wan's job to fight Vader. And if you're a fan of the lightsaber duels, you can see why. There's one that they had when they were old was, I mean, it was so quick, but yet,
Not very interesting. Yeah.
right. But what happens if you strike me down? I'll become more powerful than you could possibly imagine. I don't know. Maybe I'm too young yet to know what happens there, but it is something where having the stories can help you frame ritual and can help you frame your life and can help you frame your psychology too.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, especially talking about ritual. Um, it's certainly something that in the modern West we don't like.
Mhm.
Um, the practice, the regular routine of setting your mind on something other than yourself, really. But then, just like I was mentioning earlier, like we replace those with other rituals. Whether it's picking up your phone every now and then, or
Mhm.
uh, watching a TV show before bed, or whatever it is, and you just have to stop and think like which one was better, which one was more
Yeah.
helpful, and yeah, I hope we're not the only ones seeing this, and that eventually we can kind of temper our world with these timeless truths that we seem to be a little bit shy on these days.
Hey, the great news is if they can keep people knowing where a border is for 7,000 years after the ice age, then they can keep us too. I
Yeah.
really do think there's a lot of truth and hope to even the humility of knowing there's something bigger than you. Um, to not trying to take my ego and impose it upon the world, but instead to say, all right, well, I'm going to do my part and see what
Hmm.
happens. Um, Maybe that's through compassionate service, which I think is, it's the Kuan Yin, but that's also Christ's calling to compassionate service. Maybe it's the calling to sharing stories. Maybe it's a calling to re-enchantment. Uh, Either way, I mean, the patterns presented themselves in so many different ways. Maybe it's a story about Buddha. Maybe it's an Aesop fable. Either way, we're still telling it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that seems like a great place to leave it. I hope that we can catch up again here very soon. We've got
Wholeheartedly agree.
many myths to still cover, and I look forward to that. So, thanks for coming. We will continue this again very
Hey,
soon.
a pleasure as always, Matt. Thank you.
See ya.